And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, live on Facebook. My name is Kim Ayres. I'm a creative professional portrait and landscape, a professional portrait and narrative photographer. Not off to a good start, and it's still only episode 3, I suppose. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes, the photo shoot I did for them. And I'm also going to be looking at the notion of diagonals and the impact that they can have on the composition of your photography. And then finally, I will be talking, giving feedback and critique on photos that have been submitted during the week and answering any questions. Now, if you find any of this useful, please do consider a wee donation to paypal.me/Kim Ayres. Not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. So, I want to start off tonight talking about Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes. They are a charitable organisation set up by local volunteers to deliver essential blood and urgent medical supplies in and out of hours between hospitals and healthcare sites in the southwest of Scotland and sometimes beyond. And of course, since the whole COVID-19 thing, they've been busier than ever. Now, they're an amazing charity, and if you would like to find out more about them, then go to www.dgbloodbikes.org.uk. That's dgbloodbikes.org.uk. Now, one of the things about this shoot is it was by far and away the biggest shoot I've ever done to date. In terms of sheer numbers of people involved. It began when I'd been involved in a shoot for the local high school who were raising money, and one of their charities was Blood Bikes. I hadn't heard of them at that time, but I met them at a competition presentation. Got chatting with them. Now, at that time, they were only, I think, about 6 months established. They weren't overly big. They had, I think, probably about 2 or 3 proper bikes, motorbikes, and about 20 odd volunteers. So we started talking about the idea of what might make an interesting photo shoot. And initially, we got together, coffee, or hot chocolate cake. Cake's quite a big thing for the Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes. Anyway, we got together and we bounced ideas about, and the original idea was we thought, what if we had a sort of kids sitting on a hospital bed and you had a doctor and a nurse standing by them, and then maybe you had a Blood Bikes guy standing there looking all sort of strong and noble with, case in one hand and helmet under his arm, and maybe we could wheel one of the bikes into the shot, so it would sort of take place in a hospital room. And that all sounded quite well and good. However, one thing led to another, and it was probably about 18 months before we actually got round to doing the shoot. And by the time we sort of started really discussing it in earnest, Blood Bikes had grown quite phenomenally. They now had sort of 7 or 8 full-time bikes. They also had 3 cars and, about 80 odd volunteers. So the sense here was that just putting it into the hospital room didn't really give a sense of the size of the organisation, and they really wanted to have a strong sense of, it is all about the volunteers, and they are purely a real non-profit charity. Nobody's taking, even the admin staff and what have you are not taking a penny for this. All the money you give to Blood Bikes goes directly into making sure that they can run, sorting out the bikes, sorting out the petrol. So they wanted to have that real sort of set of the number of volunteers that were involved. So we thought, how could we sort of change this idea? So the next thing we decided was, what if we took this idea of kid on the bed and doctor and nurse, but actually took it outside? What if we put it on the side of a road, and then behind the bed you could have a stream of bikes sort of disappearing down the road into the background? Anyway, this all sounded like a lot of fun, fueled up once again on cake and hot chocolate and coffee. And but then, of course, came the problem of, well, that's all very well, but how do we make it happen? So an awful lot went into the planning of this. We went out, we did recce's, we trying to find a road that we could use. And eventually we ended up at Drumlanrig Castle, which has this really long driveway. But of course we had to, they were fine for us to use it, but we couldn't use it until after 5:30, when it was then closed to the public. Also at this stage, I realised that in order to fit everybody in, I wasn't going to be able to do it at ground level, not even with a big wide angle lens. Excuse me. So what I was going to have to do was get a bit of height. So I asked if anybody had, if they would be having a van or a truck or something that I could sort of stand on the back of. Next thing I know, they've managed to organise a cherry picker. So we set up on the day and we went for it. Now, probably the best thing to do here is what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a wee behind-the-scenes video, which will give you a good sense of. It's not very long; it's less than a minute, but it does give you a kind of sense of just the sheer scale of this shoot. So, if I not wrong one, flip over to there, bring up this, and hit play. So even though I only went up about 8 or 10 feet, I still had to, for safety reasons, I had to have a harness and bright jacket and be hooked in. A friend who had a drone giving a kind of overall sense of what it looked like. And then that's the final photo. I'll take you through that again in a moment. So just a wee thing actually here, the hat turned backwards wasn't an affectation, it was it was literally, the problem is when it was pointing forwards and I put the camera up, it kept sort of bashing against the top of the helmet, so I literally had to turn the helmet so it was facing backwards so that it wasn't getting hit by the camera. So let's flip into Photoshop and show you the photo. So this is then the final photo. As you can see, so to go, actually what I'll do, if I flip back onto here, there's a couple of things I want to point out in terms of this. So yeah, there we go, backward hat. This point here, where you can just see me, everything had been put in place. This was the final bit. I'm now heading off to go and strap into the cherry picker and start doing the photos. And I was absolutely terrified. There's so much time, so much effort had gone into this. And the problem is when you are the lead photographer, when you are the person doing all this, you have to project a sense of being in absolute control. Everybody is relying on you. Everybody else has gone to the nth degree to make this happen. All the planning, arranging to have all the volunteers, setting up the day, working with Drumlanrig Castle, and in order to satisfy or to keep all the volunteers happy, they had a trailer which was with tea and plenty of cake. A lot went into it, and if I don't deliver, there ain't no photo. Everybody's done everything else, but the weight of responsibility was on me. But the problem is you can't show it. If you, as the one in charge, if you look like you are completely nervous and barely holding it together, you don't inspire much confidence. So you have to really just have to look the part. And this bit here, I remember, there's just kind of, and now I've got to sort of go and walk up, and then I get strapped in and I'm up there, and then I'm just into shooting. But yeah, this is kind of why, so biggest shoot I'd had, and in terms of nerves, I think, as well as. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of run back over that. So if I minimize that. So we come back. So this is the final photo. So it wasn't just one photo either. In the end, I think it was 5, maybe actually probably 6 photos. What I did was I turned the camera portrait and then click, 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 click. And then in Photoshop, I edited them all together. Took a long time, took nearly as long to, well, probably took a lot longer to edit it than it did to actually shoot it. While I was editing it, there was something that I was really, really struggling with. And no matter what I did, it just kind of felt wrong. And now I'm getting really worried because I've gone to all this effort, I've got the photo, what if I can't deliver? And it was nagging me. And now, there might be one or two among you who have spotted, probably won't, most people don't, even though I tend to forget. But this image is in fact flipped from where I was on the original. If you go back to the video, you'll notice that where I'm shooting from the top here looking down. So actually they're all on the left-hand side of the road. Here they're all on the right-hand side. And this is because what I will do is I will just flip this image rotation, flip horizontal. That's the way I shot it. And even though I'd edited it to this point, almost to this point, it just kept feeling wrong. And it took a while, but then at this moment of inspiration, I realized essentially the problem was it was facing the wrong way. Now, here in the West at least, we read left to right. And that affects also how we view pictures. So all the stuff that's going on, the main chunk is down on the right here. And then you've got this string of bikes all disappearing off up into the distance. And so we have, we look at the main bit and then our eye gets taken away. We shoot off into the distance with it from your angle, shooting off that way. And so that very line of bikes is actually taking us away from where we want to be. And by flipping the image, now what happens is your eye starts at the right and then it follows it down. Now the line draws you down to exactly, it starts here and then it draws you down to where the action is. And your eye rests much more easily where it's all happening, and you can now see doctor, nurses, kid on bike, heroic blood biker with case and helmet under the arm, and string of bikes all disappearing off into the distance. If I have now, I'd be interested here actually. Any of my friends who Hebrew, Islamic, the one who read from where the text reads from right to left, not left to right in the way we do with the Roman alphabet. Does that affect the way you interact with images? If you've got any thoughts on that, do please either leave a comment in Facebook or email me or something, because it's something I'm quite fascinated to. How much does our cultural background influence the way we actually read the photos? I don't have an answer for that. If I get an answer, maybe I'll mention it in the next episode. So that was one of the things. However, there was of course this problem that when I flipped the image, suddenly you see all these bits that say blood on the front of the bike were in reverse. So I then had to go through a whole pile of editing to get these back the right way round. Now, the emergency blood bit on the car is in fact in reverse in real life. When we flipped it, I just left it sitting the same way around. But basically I had to reverse the blood on each of these bikes back to about here. On his case, I changed the 42 psi down here. And so, yeah, it was one of those major nightmares of an editing job. However, it was worth doing because ultimately I felt the whole thing worked a lot better. Now, if you're watching on the screen, I'm sitting down in this bottom left corner. I moved my screen here today because I felt that would probably give it a better wouldn't interfere quite so much with what I'm going to be talking about. However, in terms of the photo, there's quite a large gap here where nothing is really happening. And that was deliberately designed that way. The idea was that if this was blown up to become a poster or a banner of some kind, that there would be room here to be able to write in Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes. If it was a particular event, that it could be put in when and where it was happening. So coming back to that notion that I've talked about before, which is when creating a photo like this, you are designing the photo, you are thinking ahead of how the photo is going to be used. Once you understand how it's going to be used, where it's going to be used, you actually have to structure it in such a way that it's usable under those circumstances. So that gives you a sense there. Now let me just go and find the image. Having gone to all that effort, it then actually sort of sat under wraps for about a year until there was an unveiling where Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes won this wonderful award. It was given to them at the Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary by the Lord Lieutenant, and while they were being presented with that, they decided they were going to unveil the banner, and so here we go. And as you can see down in this left-hand corner, they've got something else. It's now not interfering. One of the great things about this is because it was 5 or 6 photos going across, the resolution was massive, and that really allowed it to be printed up nice and large, and you can get really quite close up to it, and it's still got all the detail in it. Lovely for me, because 99% of the photos I ever do, I never particularly see on a screen that's any larger than the one that I've got in my study. So when they're printed up, it always feels quite special. That's now hanging. It's if you go in Dumfries, if you're actually heading out towards the Crichton campus, there's the BP garage down on that little roundabout, and this poster is actually on the wall. It's at St Michael's, who are sponsoring this getting done. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about the story behind Dumfries and Galloway Blood Bikes. It was a wonderful shoot. They're an amazing charity. I was very privileged to be able to work with that many people. However terrifying it was, the sense of achievement was wonderful, and then to see it all unveiled certainly made it all feel worthwhile. So what this is leading me on to now is the notion of diagonals. Now, last week, for those who are watching, or you can go back and find on the previous videos, I will just say actually at this point that I've now set up my YouTube channel, whereby as these things go out, I'm recording them, and I'm then putting the recorded versions onto YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/Kim Ayres, if I just flip back here, you can see then you can catch up with all the episodes. Well, I say all, there's only been 2 before this one, but anyway, you can catch up with all the other episodes. And I'm also doing bite-sized chunks where I'm taking interesting pieces out of, or particularly interesting pieces out of some of the past episodes to make smaller, more digestible pieces, videos to view. Yeah, so last week I was talking about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds basically being the idea that you create this grid, like a kind of noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe grid, and where the kind of inner square, the corners of the inner square, become the important bits in the photo. However, whilst it's been adopted very strongly as a major piece of photographic composition, pretty much everybody who's been doing photography for any length of time, sooner or later, stumbles across this rule of thirds, and it shifts their photography up a level, because rather than putting everything in the middle, they put things off center, and suddenly things seem to have a bit more edge to them. The problem with it is it encourages block thinking. Because you've got 3 rows that are divided up into little squares or little rectangles, it makes you think in terms of horizontals and verticals. And that's fine, that's relatively stable. But diagonals are really where the action is. And a lot of people, they think they hear a rule of thirds and they think, oh, I understand rule of thirds. I now know everything there is to know about photography because I know the rule. As I said last week, it's not really a rule, it's more of a guideline. But I think equally important, if not more important in a lot of ways, is truly understanding the notion of diagonals and how much more energy they give to a photo. If this photo had everybody just going straight back in a line, it would be a different kind of photo. But that really strong diagonal that's just shooting across the screen, it creates a sense of movement. Even though we know everybody is sitting there, perfectly static, it creates a sense of movement, of drive, of energy. It also creates a great sense of depth, which when things are flat on, when things are just doing with the horizontal and the vertical, you don't necessarily have that sense of depth. You get the depth with the kind of perspective lines as they sort of narrow down into the picture. So, what I want to do now, I'll give you a couple of other examples of where this works. So, yeah, I'm going to have a bit of fun, I think. In a past life, we're talking, 8-9 years ago, I can't remember exactly. I used to belong to a band called Scruffy Buzzards. And we decided we needed a photo for our EP cover that was coming out. And so we did a photo shoot, and this photo was never used. This is just one from the shoot. And essentially it's a kind of standard indie band type photo, 4 blokes in front of a garage door. And like I say, this one's unedited. I would have then cropped it in, I would have added bits of texture and all what have you. Now, the main thing about this is, whilst there are a couple of diagonals in it, you can see this is a bouzouki, by the way, which is kind of like a large mandolin in a lot of ways. But there's a diagonal going up here, and there's a sort of slight diagonal here, a little bit there, but mostly the powerful lines here are vertical. It's up and down. And yeah, it's got 4 blokes in front of a garage door with varying degrees of how moody we were able to look for that particular shot. But we didn't end up doing this. I became aware very quickly that it wasn't really doing what we wanted to do. So we'd got this other idea of creating a more dynamic kind of photo where we were going to maybe beat each other up with the instruments. So with that, yes, this is the edited version, the final one that ended up on the cover. And it's a lot of fun, there's a lot of energy in it. I mean, yes, we're all standing posing, but everybody's got a certain tension in the way they're holding the instruments, all pulling our faces kind of thing. But what ramps that up to the nth degree is all these really, really, really strong diagonal lines. There's very little in the way of anything that really is. I mean, there's a couple of vertical lines, but mostly wherever possible we've sort of bent the legs, we've turned the arms, we've got all the instruments sitting at angles. And then what I've done is I've created an overlay, a textured overlay. You can see it kind of gets all rough and grungy around the side, but that grunge itself has got diagonal lines built into it as well. So there's a huge amount of power and energy goes into that, and it was a lot of fun, and it got used widely. It was a fun photo to have. Another example, very gentle example. Maybe let's say we take the notion of a tulip. Even with something as soft and gentle and peaceful and tranquil as a flower photo, if you imagine that flower straight up on a strong vertical, it's fine, but it's a softer photo. When it's leaning over, there's that little bit more energy in it. There's that little bit more movement in it. There's a notion of tension. There's an idea with photography, sort of dynamic tension. The reason rule of thirds works better than just having something sitting in the middle is because our brains are geared to what doesn't quite look right. If something looks perfectly safe and stable, our brains will tend to ignore it. But if something's slightly out of kilter, we're primed to notice. Now, if so, instead of something being centre, something is off centre, you notice it a little bit more. And so if you're noticing it, your attention is on it a little bit longer, which in this day and age, particularly when everybody sort of, we shoot through the photos we see online, we go through our feeds at high speed, trying to grab anybody's attention can be quite difficult. But once you start, now a diagonal is inherently more tense than a vertical or a horizontal. If you had a tree or a pole, if a pole was sort of sitting straight up, it's stable. If it's lying down, it's stable. But if it's at an angle, it feels like it's in movement. It feels like it could just about be falling over. Maybe you've captured it as it's falling, or maybe it could fall at any moment. That tension adds energy to the photo. It adds a level of interest and capture. Let's show another another example. Would be, now I was doing a shoot at a factory where they're welding up the chains for trawlers that go out at sea and trawl up the seabeds. Now, this photo was never used. This was just one of those that I was taking while I was sort of getting a hang of what the light was doing and where we were. And again, what you can see here is strong verticals, strong horizontals. So what I then did was I moved around and I put the wide angle lens on the camera, and we now end up with this. And now, whilst there's a strong horizontal there, that's pretty much the horizontal there. Even the verticals are slightly off that kind of, because of the wide distortion of the wide angle lens. This is coming down an angle. He's standing at an angle. The angles of the table, none of them are, because of that distortion, none of them are sitting at 90 degrees. And the extra level of energy and tension that's put into it is quite remarkable when you consider, like I said, now this one's edited, this one is not. But regardless of the editing, there's a limit to what I could do with this, whereas this one does have much more of a kind of a feel to it. Another example, even something like this wonderful old bridge over the River Dee and just south of Clattering Shaw's Loch. The fact that it runs down this diagonal here, and then the reflection creates a diagonal here. I could have taken it straight on and had even arches. Well, I might have been able to, but I'd have probably been knee deep in water. But that aside, the diagonals it gives you a depth that's going across the screen, as well as seeing the depth that's going through, seeing the road bridge behind it and through to the river further down. But these lines through are giving it more energy. And where it really comes into play, to show you a difference, I did a set of photos with Fitch and McAndrew, a couple of potters based up in Corsica in the Galloway Hills. And let me show you this photo. Now, this photo is of Hannah while she's applying relief onto the clay. And it's very much about the verticals and the horizontals. And we wanted this because it's a soft, gentle process. When you watch her, she's very concentrated. It's almost zen really, in that moment of painting the relief onto the plate. And so we didn't want a hard energy with that. However, her husband Doug, when we were doing him, I was shooting him building a pot. And here now, with that elbow going up, with his hand going into the pot, you've got this incredibly strong diagonal line. He's tilted over and the whole energy is really built into it. This horizontal line here is completely, and the little verticals behind are completely outweighed by the power of that diagonal. Another one here where, again, if we'd had him just sort of straight on, it would have been a much quieter shot. But with the tilt of the head, with the arm coming up, with this arm coming down, you get the water coming off the sponge. But it's not just the water coming off the sponge. He could have been straight up with the squeezing the water out. It's that center, the diagonals are where the energy and the movement is. So that's really what I wanted to talk about. I want you to, when you next get out the camera, find whatever you're taking a photo of, but start thinking about how you can introduce more tension into it. How you can introduce, not just going off center, but look at the diagonals. Where are the diagonals happening? Can you introduce them into the picture by changing your camera angle? And play, see what happens with that. And I think once you start to really play with it, it sort of becomes slightly addictive and it's fun, and it gives you something else to play with. It's another tool in your tool bag for developing the photos. So there we go. That's what I wanted to say about diagonals. We're now going to move on to the critique, question and answer sessions. The first image I'm going to play with here comes from Daphne. And Daphne says, "Hi Kim, this is a very old picture. I scanned. I can't believe I was ever that thin. Check the afro. The background and shadows are terrible. I can crop it and enhance the colours and contrast, but how do I get rid of the shadows and the pots and pans?" There's a trickiness here. So, first of all, of course, now I've got quite a small photo here, so I don't have a great deal to play with. But yeah, so you crop in a little bit, remove that a little bit like that. She's now sitting along that third rule of thirds line, and there's a little diagonal sort of coming out of there. So immediately if we crop that, it's made it slightly better. But she's not really wanting the pots and pans and the shadow. It's a really tricky one, this. The pans are slightly easier to get rid of if you're using Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, there is another program called GIMP, G-I-M-P. I haven't used it, but I hear a lot of good things about it. Most importantly, it's free, but it is a very strong, powerful editing machine. Editing piece of software rather. Now, I have a healing tool where if I zoom in here and I do that, it automatically, the artificial intelligence reads around the space. So if I do that there, miraculously it's removed the pans. I could also use the clone tool where I copy a bit of so the clone tool, if I click there and I can start copying, cloning one part of the photo over the other. So what I can do is I can clone a bit of wall and just, if I wanted, take that down there, just loosely paint it round. You have to be a bit more careful with it, but very, very roughly you do that. The shadow, the only way I can think of really doing the shadow is to essentially use the clone tool. If I just get rid of that bit up there, gives me a little bit more space. So, and this is very rough, but you essentially clone that little bit of painted wall above it, and then you paint it in You might have to come back and do this a few times. Now, the problem we've got here is that afro, which, as we can see over on this side, there's a lot of texture to it, and when I come around here, that's all very smooth, but it's not really got the texture that I wanted, that you wanted. So if I line up that wall a little bit better. This is very, very rough, and obviously if I was doing it properly, it's tricky. Hair is one of the trickiest things to try and get done, and hair that's disappeared into a shadow where you can barely tell the difference is just about impossible, because the colour here is pretty much the same as the colour here. It's very difficult indeed. There comes a point where you kind of have to say, well, maybe there's a limit. Maybe I just, you know, it depends what you're needing the photo for. If you just want to clean it up, play with it a bit, then fine, go ahead with that. But very often with photos, there's a certain amount of, well, I wouldn't start from here, which of course isn't very helpful. But you are kind of limited. I mean, even if we go back to this, that bit of hair looks awful. Maybe what we could do is I could copy this bit of hair and paste that up onto a separate little area, and then if I transform that by flipping it horizontally, we can now see I've got this here, and if I move that around to here, just sort of slot it in, say roughly there, then now the hair fits. Now the wall was darker on this side than it was on here, so what I could do is if I create a curves. Now there's an option when you're doing curves, there's this little bit down here. If I click that, it means it will only brighten or darken the layer below it, not the whole thing. So if I brighten that or darken it, or just, you know, if I darken it, it looks like that. If I brighten it too much, like that. So the idea is I just put it down until it sort of more or less, best as I can, matches the wall behind. It's not perfect, but that's kind of there. What I could also do is I could click a mask and just lightly paint out some of the worst bits of that. So we've now got texture that we've added onto here. It's not absolutely perfect, but it sort of gives you a slightly better sense. And obviously we go in and clear out that shadow as well. So Daphne, if that's, hopefully that helps a bit. Like I say, this is just fairly quick. It might hopefully give you a few pointers of where you can go with it if you want to really play. But you are completely and utterly involved in the clone tool and the patch tool if you're using Photoshop. And like I say, if you can't get the texture on one side of the head, steal it from the other and transform it, flip it. Right, what else do we have here? Next picture, I'm going to go with Paul. Now, Paul says, hi Kim, I tried to improve the sky but in this image, but to no avail. I even tried Luminar sky replacement, but it keeps overlapping the heads. Is it possible for you to show how to do this in Photoshop? Now, in some ways, this one's even more difficult than the photo of Daphne. And the reason for that is, fine, we've got a sky here, but the sky is textured. We've got light patches, we've got dark patches. And then the statue itself is bronze and it's gone green. And the tones of these greens are very similar to the tones of the greys around them. And then they're light and dark as well. So the problem we end up with is, and this is where Paul has come across it, is the standard tools you have for selecting areas don't really work so well. So if I take this little tool up here, which is a selection tool, you see I can start drawing around. You see it immediately leaps and starts coming around. So it's captured all this bit of sky, except it's not caught the heads. So if I hold down the Alt key, then I can start kind of coming back in again and painting, but it's gone over again. It doesn't like this little edge where the grey and the green, you can see it's very similar. So I take my finger off, I try and put it back in, I put my finger back on, I try. And then similarly up here, I can sort of fill it in a bit. It still happily sort of goes around and grabs the outside. So really you've kind of got to get in and just, it's not happy with it. Of course, don't forget you also want to mask the inside of the legs here, those little bits, and come back out and out mask that. So what this has done then is this has given us a sky area as such. Now, if I copy that, then that's the sky on its own. Or if I go back to the quick selection, select inverse and copy that, then we've now cut out the sky. Alternatively, what I could do is mask it, so that now masking it allows me to paint some of it back in. So I don't know what I will do. I will just delete that mask there, so we've got, that's the original, and then that's the one without it, with where the sky's masked off. And at this point you can then, if you've got a sky, you can try slotting a sky in. And so if I, let's say I now here we're going to get into a problem whereby you've then got to find the right sky. The program that Paul talked about where it just sort of slots a new sky in, I've seen some really awful versions of this done where people have put in a completely inappropriate sky for the picture. So for example, I might decide that I'm going to open this picture which has got this glorious sunset. Now it's just taken at Loch Hen on an evening, and it is just absolutely amazing. Those colours, I was just transfixed that I probably took about 200 photos in the space of 20 minutes as the colours just seem to get richer and richer. And you go, oh wow, that's a beautiful sky. What if I put that sky onto this picture? So let's drag that up to, let's put that below there, and just make it a little bit bigger so we've not got the lake, so the lake disappears behind the hills. And there you go. And it looks awful. I mean, it really just looks, it's the wrong sky for this. These guys here are lit from the sun coming from the left towards them. So the idea there would be a sunset behind them just doesn't work at all. So you've got to find a sky that's going to fit. Now, having gone, if I go back to this mask, by the way, what I can do is I can now kind of come in closer with the mask and tidy it up a little bit so that these lighter patches aren't showing quite so much. But it's fiddly, it's not particularly nice. I mean, there is a thing here where, much like I said about Daphne's photo, I kind of wouldn't start from here. If you're wanting to do a shoot where you're going to replace the sky, you really need a plainer sky. Textured sky is really difficult. Now, a different example for this could be, I was playing around with, I did a shoot for well, I was doing some test shots. I was out. We were looking at Dalswinton Church, which is this lovely little church. It was a kids' church, in fact. Made of the Dalswinton estate. It's essentially, I mean, a Swedish kids' church. I mean, it's your original IKEA, where they shipped the parts, built the church specifically for the workers who operated on Dalswinton estate. Can't remember exactly when, 100 years ago-ish, give or take a couple of decades. And it's a lovely, it's a great wedding venue. It's a beautiful place. Now, we happen to be out there doing a recce for doing a photo shoot. That sky, it was dull, it was drizzling, the sky's whited out. Now, once again, what you can do, because it's whited out, it gives you a little bit more option to put in a slightly more convincing sky. Now, once again, if I stick this over the top, it's just going to be completely inappropriate for it. So now what I can do is I can play up in this top right corner. You've got different ways you can darken, and what happens then is this darkens anything in the photo that's darker than what it's overlaying. The picture will come up. So lighten, multiply. There's all sorts of different kinds of things you can do for different ways of. But if I do multiply, I'll come back off that for a moment. Now, what I can do is if I say select color range and I select the whites or that particular shade of grey. Let me just. Now, if I come to here and add, wrong way, add a mask, you can now see that it's just filling in the white gaps. Now, it's not really working particularly well on here, but if I just, let's see, take that and turn that white, make that a little bit bigger, and just sort of paint it in as such, I can kind of get away with a lot more. Now, not perfect at this point, but you can go in and fill in the details yourself later. But once again, what we have here is a pretty inappropriate sky. You wouldn't have that kind of, I'm just using that because it shows you the contrast. Maybe what if we have, but really for something like Dalswinton Church, what you want is, it's a dull day, so you want but you want a bit more texture in the sky. So with that, what I might do is I might take something like this photo, which has got a beautifully textured sky. Now, if I then use that and I take that mask and stick that up there, and do that as darken at the moment. The point being that you've now got this texture in the sky, which looks a bit more realistic. And then if I was to take this image and start playing around with it and go into camera raw and maybe just boost the clarity, you know, sharpen that contrast a bit, add a bit more texture to it, boost the contrast, maybe give it a bit of a vignette. And now we've got a much kind of grittier, moodier kind of photo with a dramatic sky behind it. Now, so if you're going to replace the sky, it becomes much, much easier to do if you've got a relatively uniform sky. If we try and take that idea of overlaying the sky on Paul's picture, well, he's already got a cloudy sky and it's not going to know what's light and what's dark, and the whole thing just becomes a bit of a mess. So although I haven't really solved the problem, like I say, you can do the masking if you want. You just have to then go in and fiddle around at the edges painstakingly. There isn't a quick and easy answer to it. The real answer, the real thing that I want to point out is that by and large, sometimes you take a photo and you just don't have what you want. And really, if you if you want to have that great photo, you've got to chase it. We talked about this last week, I think, that a lot of the best landscape photographers, they don't just miraculously happen to turn up at the right time and take these wonderful photos. They go out on a limb. They get up at extraordinary hours in the morning so they can get the sunrise, and they miss several of them because it turns out it was cloudy, or they trot off to remote locations in order to get particular angles. So fine, you've got there's a photo there, but is it worth it going to that amount of effort to just get the right kind of? What kind of sky were you looking for? What would make it better? Is it worth the amount of effort you're going to put into it? Now, obviously, that's sometimes there's a photo fine and it's just for your own use. How much you want to play with it, go for it, play, learn. You learn by doing. Sometimes you're on a commission, and if this photo is a key commission to then be appearing on the front of a magazine, which is going to be talking about Remembrance Day and all the rest of it, and it's going on the front cover of a magazine, you were commissioned to get it, then you should have gone back several times and made sure you got the good weather for it, got the different lighting conditions. Trying to rescue something which isn't really up at that standard, you only do that if you absolutely have to. If this was the only time you got that shot and you have to have that photo done, at which point you are going to have to go in and go around the edges. So, while I might not have fully solved the problem, hopefully I've still given a kind of bit of a learning experience and understanding of where you come from for that. So, let's move on to the next picture. VG sent me several photos, but I decided to just pick one. And she went for this one. And her comment was, this one, Kim, it looked so majestic, but I flawed somewhere. A bit flawed somewhere. I was not able to capture the height or the width of it as I see it. While framing such structures, what should we keep in mind, and how can we do justice to the subject? Now, it is a tricky thing when we are there in front of these wonderful monuments, or we're there in front of these amazing mountains. We are so aware of the sheer height and scale of these things, and they are awesome. They fill us with a sense of, wow, this is amazing. And then we pull out our camera and we go click, and it just doesn't seem to do it justice. So I get that feeling. I mean, I've not been here. It looks like an amazing place. But that notion of taking a photo which just doesn't seem to represent the size and scale. And by and large, then, the answer to this, a bit like the last one, is, well, there's two things going on. One is time of day would make a difference. This was taken, by the look of the shadows, relatively around midday-ish. I don't know, probably somewhere between sort of 11 and 1 or 11 and 2. And because the sun is by and large coming from straight above, if you came back towards sunset, you would have deep shadows cast along one side. You might have one of the sides is lit up, the other is in deeper shadow, and there's an awful, although this is a very low res photo because it's just been done in Facebook, you can obviously see that there's a lot of texture going on. And if you got the sun at just the right angle, all those textures would sort of leap out. So that would immediately give you a sense of, because you would see the textures more, it would give you a sense of the scale of it. But the other thing really is the problem of being too close. When you're up against a mountain and you're looking up, it's there but there isn't really a kind of comparison. What you're kind of better off is if you are higher up to begin with, if you are further back and you have an elevation, then when you look down the way and then up, you get a much better sense of the sheer size and scale of it. Yeah, here we go. So let me just open this photo for you. Now, it's a photo I took in the Lake District. Here we go. Now, this is a panorama. It's 3 or 4 photos stitched together, and you can sort of see off down the valley. Now you've got that. Now what I would say with this is, if you were sort of standing down on the valley floor taking this photo, those mountains wouldn't feel quite as impressive. It's because at this point we've come along the valley floor and we've now started winding our way up over the next pass, and now we've got some height and we're looking back. You go down to the valley floor and then the mountains come up, and that gives you a much better sense of scale and a sense of size than you actually do get at ground level. So now I don't know from your original photo, VG, whether there's any possibility of that. Sometimes standing further back, it's about giving the surrounds. Sometimes you get in close, sometimes you're looking for other objects like overhanging trees and what have you to frame a subject. But when you're trying to get a sense of scale, you sometimes need to be further back to sort of place it in a context so that you can see the small thing, the tiny things that are next to it, in order to get a sense of just how big it is. So I hope that gives you a bit of an answer on that. Now, let's go for the next photo I wanted to look at. Now, the next one is Graham. And now, Graham said, "Hi Kim, help with this one. Feels flat." Okay, what do we do with this? Now, this is the photo. Now, the first thing I'm going to say here is what we've got is we have a black and white photo, and then there's a little touch of green down here. This is known more commonly as selective colour, where you take just one aspect of a photo and you colour that in, and the rest of it is left to be black and white. Wedding photographers use it to death. You have the black and white photo and the single red rose. Seen it so many times. There was a point when this first became relatively easy in Photoshop to do, that there was an explosion of it, and at the time it seemed really new and wow. It's kind of been overused a great deal, so it doesn't tend to have the same kind of impact that it used to. The other thing is if you're going to use selective colour, you've then got to think what you're using it on. The single red, because the one bit that is coloured is going to draw all the attention. So are you drawing the attention to the right thing? So I've seen a picture of, somebody there doing something, and the story was what they were up to, but their boots happen to be blue and in colour. So your attention goes away from the story and straight down to the boots. And the boots aren't really that interesting, but they were the bit that the photographer decided to edit it to do. So when you're using selective colour, you really got to think why am I using it, and is it really adding to the story, or could I get that story a different way? Now what we've got here is a black and white picture of the woods. We've got, by the look of it, there's this stone wall, what might have been, probably, I would say it was a building. So we've got a corner of a building here, and we've got this tree growing out the top of the building. We've got all these lovely old stones, and what Graham's decided to do is highlight this little tree that's starting to grow within it. So that then is presumably the story that you were trying to get. I would say on a story level, where part of the problem with this photo is really, I would think that the story is much more this tree and the root system as it's coming through the wall and the caving down wall. That's the bit that's, if you're talking about the notion of nature reclaiming where mankind has been, then that little sapling just coming out of the rock has already been dwarfed by the fact that so much out of the wall has been overgrown and broken down by nature reclaiming its space. So I'm not entirely convinced that that's the best place to have the story. So in that sense, if we just straightforwardly turn that to black and white, so I'll just say if I go to hue saturation and just desaturate, so I've taken the colour out of that, we're now back to basically a black and white photo. It says it feels a bit flat, and flatness is quite often to do with contrast and, well, as playing with it. Now, again, with this, what we've got is up in the top part here, we've got the sky behind, and that sky is very bright. That sky grabs all the attention. So it's over dominant. So immediately I would first of all be tempted just to crop some of that out. Even if you took it down to something like that, you've immediately, or maybe even a fraction more. We've now stopped that sky being so dominant, and we're pulling into this area here. Now we've got this. If I just create that new layer. What we've got here is texture, but this texture isn't being shown very well. So we need to increase the contrast with that. So again, if I go up to camera raw, now if I just change the contrast, the blacks get black, or, you know, not enough contrast. We can see more detail, but now it does really feel flat. Put up the contrast, we've lost too much into the shadows. So that's where this lovely little one, clarity, kind of comes into its own. And if I do that, clarity sort of grabs hold of the edges of where where things are, and then it sort of creates the contrast into the edges. And if I pull up that, there's also a little one above here called texture, which does subtly different but similar kind of thing. And then again, play with the vignette a bit, just pull that in a little bit, pull in the corners a little bit so you get drawn. So now we look at that, and there's much more texture has come out of it. That sense of flatness, I think, has disappeared because we can make out the depth and the structure, and we can see several layers going back. Whether you'd still want to have that little thing in green or not, I suppose it is down to your choice. It sounds quite damning. Yeah, I wouldn't have done it, but for the reasons that I suggested. But there's also a matter of taste. If that's what you want to do, you do that, and that's okay. But in terms of the way I read this photo, what I would also say here is I think there's a chunk over here which isn't doing much. I'd be again more tempted to sort of bring this in something like that. And now I kind of feel this is where the story's happening. We've got the story, we've got the texture. So that's really where I would go with that. I hope that helps, Graham, but we're old friends. You're absolutely free to have a go at me when this is over and tell me that I'm not right. We'll have a fun chat about it. Okay, now, final image I want to talk about tonight has come from Mandy. Mandy says, "Hi Kim, I took this photo a couple of years ago. I'm really pleased with it. But each time I see it, I think it's not quite finished. Not sure what it is, but wondered if you had any thoughts." So let's take a look at this photo. And it's a beautiful photo. I mean, this is the kind of photo I would love to take. Woman in white dress, probably wedding dress of some kind, down in a pool. We've got a waterfall in the background. We've got this old stone bridge, all the rocks coming down. Got the sunlight dappling through the trees and onto your model. And it's lovely. It's the bit where you go, yes, okay, I'm happy with that. I like that photo. What else could you do with it? So you're coming to me and saying you're pleased with it, but each time I see it, I feel it's not quite finished. Wondered if you got any thoughts with this. So I said, okay, well, if I'm going to look at this, I'm going to say, well, what else could you do with it? Again, this is my take on it. If you're absolutely free to disagree. And I'm sure there will be other viewers who go, no, I wouldn't do what he's going to do now. But what I'm trying to do is just really open up your mind to other ways of doing it. So, in terms of story, the layout, the first thing that does strike me is this bridge up the top here is very high up. It's well out of reach. Now you've obviously pulled back far enough. That arch was important to you, and it's part of the composition. Kind of creates that sense of looking through the arch window. If you're old enough to get that reference, and it's a beautiful shape. But I can't help but wonder if that arch was a little bit lower, you might sort of get into the story a little bit more. Now, again, just a suggestion. What I'm going to do is, so if I took this arch and I'll come down and just take, so I've got the bottom of this leaf here. I'll copy that, paste it back on, and then drag it down a bit. Now, this is just very rough. Do a little see-through thing here so I can see where the arch is on my new bit in relation to that waterfall, because I don't want to lose the waterfall. Now if I bring that down to, say, here, take that back up to full strength. Ignore the top part for the moment. In fact, what we'll do is, that wasn't what I meant to do. I'll take that, I'll just pull that down to the top there and crop that in. Now obviously this isn't quite right, so we mask the layer and start painting the other layer that was up back in underneath it. Now, so if I paint the waterfall back in, I can take it up to here, but I don't have to, but make sure I don't knock the bridge out, because I want to keep that bridge in. And I can just take that bit off and the rocks blend into each other, bring that little bit of tree back in, and we've now managed to remove that obvious line which was sitting there. I'll be careful here, I could go in and do a bit more, but to kind of keep some of that. I was careful here, I want to keep that bridge in. In fact, actually I'll just go back over there and use the original part from behind. So we've now got that as a story. It was that, it's now this. Now to me, that makes it slightly, you've brought all the elements that little bit closer together, so it feels the story's a little bit more inclusive. You're not having to sort of, sometimes if the elements are too far apart, you've got this bit of story here, you've got that bit of story there, but because you're jumping for it, it doesn't flow quite as well. Now, like I said, very rough, you could move this up and down, but my instinct is to sort of go to change that. The next thing is to, I see you've already got, it's darker in the corners, you've already vignetted round a little bit to kind of pull the attention in. Now there's a couple of extra things we can do here. So if I copy all that and paste, so I've got another layer which has got the whole thing in. Let me go into, pull it back into Camera Raw, because this will give me the quickest result of what I want to do. If I click auto, it's going to just brighten it up. So it may be a little bit too much, more than I want. So I'm not going to do the auto, I'm going to play with it. Maybe I'll just boost it a little bit on the exposure. But what I've got to be really careful about here is this white dress. And this white dress is kind of whiting out somewhat. There's detail and texture in it, which we're not really getting. Now, if I take this highlights and I pull the highlights down like that, now, the whole thing's become a bit darker, but you notice up in the waterfall and up here, you can now really see the shape of her dress underneath and the fact that it's all lacy, like netting coming out at the sides. And then that netting feature, especially when you're standing in a pool, creates an extra level of story. So if I boost it up to there, if I boost those highlights, then it whitens out and it just looks like she's got a really wide dress on, which is another story again. But we've lost the texture, but by pulling those highlights right down, we've now got this texture here. And if I then boost that a bit more with adding a little bit more texture, maybe go into that clarity again, like I said earlier, maybe because I've lowered the whites, I'll just brighten that a fraction there, boost that clarity, and now we've now got a lot more texture in here. So to compare from that to that. Now, maybe you'd want to keep the background soft, you could mask some of that out as well. But we can see really, especially when it comes to your model here, is we've got a lot more texture in the dress. We've got more texture in her hair. And also because there's a slight hyper-realism to it. It is slightly over-exaggerated, but to me it makes it slightly more otherworldly. And I think you see the beautiful thing about this photo, a beautiful idea and the story behind the photo, where you've got the woman in this beautiful dress wandering into the water in this beautiful woodland with the old rocks and the stone bridge, is otherworldly. You're tapping into those kind of fairy tales and what have you. You wouldn't be too surprised to see, fairies or dryads sitting on the rocks. So is there a way we could exaggerate this a little bit more? Now, I think if we could play with a colour tweak. Now, there's a lovely little trick where you play with oranges and blues. Now, what I'm going to do here, for those who use Photoshop, if you click here and you go to Channel Mixer. So the Channel Mixer allows you to play with the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel. So if I take the reds and remove the reds, it all becomes very bluey green, or I overcook the reds, it becomes very sort of yellowy orange. Likewise, I can move the greens up and down, and I can move the blues up and down. Now this is on the red channel. You've got red channel, green channel, blue channel. Each of them work on their own. But what we're talking about here is the red channel. Now what I'm going to do with the red channel is I'm going to up that green from 0 to 100. And I'm going to counteract it with the blue by going to minus 100. Now, this in itself is overcooked. But if we take it and just inch a little bit into it, now what's happened is all those greens have become yellower. It's become a slightly more autumn thing. Now, it's a bit too overcooked with the orange. So what we really want to do is we want to bring some more blue into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this image. And if I go into Camera Raw filter, we can play with the white balance temperature. See up here, it says white balance. I don't know whether you can see that where you are, but if you've got Camera Raw, you'll know where it is. It's this top slider. And you can move things yellower and you can move things bluer. If you move things yellower, it tends to get warmer until you get to a point whereby it just becomes insipid. Or you can move it bluer and it gets cooler until you get to a point whereby it's a total ice maiden. Doesn't quite look right. So the idea is that you want to nudge it. I would say if we nudge it a little bit into the cooler, like that. So we've gone from that to that. Hopefully you can see the difference there. Now when we add the channel mixer back in, it should pick up on some of those. Yes, now we notice the white, the water. Okay, there's the browner parts of the water, but there's these bluer edges to it as well. So if we just sort of nudge that a little bit, maybe to something like that. Now what we've got is there's bits of green, there's bits of orange and green. It's got a much more kind of autumnal feel. And that seasonal change, again, in this sort of fairy mythology, things always happen on the cusp of, on the changes. It never happens in the middle of something. It's at dawn, it's at dusk, it's at where boundaries meet, where water meets land, where land meets sky. So similarly, seasonally, where there's a change in the season, Halloween is an ancient Celtic festival, and all the spooks and spirits is right on that cusp between autumn and winter. It's not coincidental. So now what we have, so if I just go back to show you what the original was like. Obviously I've cropped in and moved things, so we've gone from that to that. So what that does then is hopefully it gives you another idea of where you could go. So we've cropped we've taken the stone bridge from the top and we've brought it down a level, so that that's kind of made it feel the story's more kind of encapsulated in the area that you're in. But maybe you like the length. If you like that original height, I would have said probably better would have been to step back a little bit more and get a little bit more of that height, get a bit more of that bridge, so that the height is really what it's supposed to be about. but as it doesn't. I feel it's just that little bit too far. This is the way I would go about it. And then there's that notion of what we've done now is we brought out the texture in her dress and the moss and what have you. And it looks like the light, because we've kind of oomphed the texture. We've made the light slightly light, or it looks, you can really sort of, and we've shifted the colours to yellow. You can see it looks really like the sun really is glistening off all these bits and pieces. And I think the whole thing has got much more of a kind of magical fairy feel to it. So that's pretty much about it in terms of the questions I was asked this morning. So, or over the last, well, I would say last, the questions I've been asked over the last week, but actually nearly everything's just come in the last 24 hours. So if you would like your picture, you would like some feedback on your picture, if you've got a picture where you think, I kind of like this, but I can't see where it's gone wrong, or I would like some feedback, or I'd like, submit your pictures. The Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, type it into Facebook search, you will find it. If you're not already a member, just join, and then post your picture. Let me know what it is you would like, what aspect you would like me to tackle, or what kind of feedback you would like. If you've got a question about photography in general, one of these things that you always wanted to know but were too scared to ask, again, put it in. There's also an option if you want to stick in a photo and put at the front group critique, then that means anybody else in the group can also come in and start putting comments underneath about how they would tackle a photo. And then you're not just dealing with how the way I would do it, you're getting a bunch of other opinions as well. So that's something to do. So if you like what I've been doing, and you do consider the idea of a donation, paypal.me/Kim Ayres. And also I will be, tune in every Tuesday, 7:30. Now, I will just flip over to Facebook now, just to see if there are any extra messages. Let's see if I can find... no, just got a couple. Hi from Mandy. Hi Yolanda, enjoying talk, thank you. Hey Pat. Rupinder, I'm glad you're enjoying it. And VG, I'm amazed for you, VG. Thank you so much for staying up. VG is in India, which is 5.5 hours further ahead than we are, so it must be roughly 10 to 2 in the morning for you. Go get some sleep now. We can chat on Facebook later. So yeah, all it really leaves me to say is thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful. If you, like I say, if you haven't already, join the Facebook group, and also you subscribe to me on YouTube as well. If you're watching this on Facebook, go over to youtube.com/Kim Ayres, hit subscribe. If you're watching the recorded version of this on YouTube, subscribe, please. And hope to see you next Tuesday at 7:30 on Facebook Live. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.